Good evening. My name is Don Blahowiak. I'm with the School of Professional and Extended Studies, and we are one of the two partners that have put this series of conversations together. Our partner is the other one that would be so obvious because we're here in the library, and they have also been behind this series of conversations about the books that shaped America, a list of books that were put together by the Library of Congress. And this is the second in our series of conversations about some of those books, and this series goes on through part of the summer and then picks up back in the fall. We'll tell you a little bit more about some of the upcoming discussions before we say goodnight. But we're going to say hello and let you know that there's coffee in the back, tea, some good refreshments, and there's going to be a good conversation here this evening. And we're going to talk about one of the great books that helped shape the society we live in today, How the Other Half Lives, Jacob Riis. It's a book about poverty, as you well know, and when I was growing up in the Midwest in the 1960s, statistically I'm told I was poor, and I knew that in a very minor way, viscerally. My shoes had holes in them, and we had government assistance at some point, and that was part of the legacy of some of the reforms that you're going to hear about tonight. But in no way was that anything like the experience of some of the people that you're going to see and hear about this evening. And the conversation we're going to have tonight is a conversation. So, in a society where sometimes discussion is polemic and talking points, we'd really like you to engage here this evening. So we have an outstanding presenter, a distinguished scholar. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her in a moment, who will lead our conversation. But we really want this to be a conversation. That's the point. It's not polemic. It's not a lecture. It is a conversation. So the invitation is genuine to engage and throw your own experiences in, and to really talk about these issues and how it's affecting you and our society broadly. And that's really the idea behind the whole series here, is to engage in the ideas broadly and to participate so we can talk about these ideas that are still resonating, in some cases well over 100 years or so after they were introduced into our society. So let's talk about who our presenter is this evening to get us talking and thinking about the ideas of Jacob Riis. And she is Professor Pamela Nadell. She holds the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History here at American University. Pam chairs the Department of History, and she directs the Jewish Studies program. Her most recent book is Making Women's Histories Beyond National Perspectives. It's my great pleasure to welcome, as your facilitator for this evening, Professor Pamela Nadell. Pam?
Thanks so much. Thank you. Normally I wouldn't use this, but I was told that because we're filming, so I'm going to have to use the microphone, so forgive me. I should also tell those of you who are sitting at tables that if you want, they're really comfy couches right up here in the front row, and you're welcome to come and sit at those. So what I thought I would do is I'd like to give you some background first before we launch into the discussion. And I also wanted to show you some images of Jacob Riis. And I'm really curious, how many of you have read all or part of the book? Okay, oh great, all right, fabulous. How many of you have editions like mine that have no photos? Only me. Wow. It must be because I must have like a copy that I probably got in graduate school, and so they were much less expensive, I guess, without the photos. So let me tell you something about Riis first. As you know, obviously, Riis was a writer and a photographer, but what you may not know is that he was largely a forgotten man from his death in 1914 until in 1947, there was an exhibit of his photos by Alexander Alland in New York. And so you can see the catalog from that exhibit. And that that kind of launched a recovery, a rediscovery of Riis as a photographer and especially as a photojournalist. And the reason I have this image here of the Museum of the City of New York, I couldn't find one of the exhibit, but in 1995, there was an exhibition on urban poverty in New York. And what the curators at the Museum of the City of New York did is they juxtaposed 61 of Riis's photos with 64 photos by contemporary photojournalists. And what they were really saying was that Riis was the first American photojournalist. Really, kind of an important statement about him. So let me tell you a little bit about Jacob Riis. He was a Danish-American social reformer, what we would consider a muckraking journalist today, and most importantly, a social documentary photographer. Although you have to remember that when he was making his photographs, that this is not like today with the snap and point and shoot cameras. And so he was actually one of the very first people to use flash and to go in to, or a version of flash, and to go in and into these settings and stage those images. That's why they often look so very much kind of, static images and posed, and because he couldn't in terms of technology, he just couldn't take those photographs any other way. So Riis was living as he came to the United States in 1870, and he was living in New York. And this is what New York looked like. I think this is an image of New York in 1880. And of course, they're not colored in green, but those squares, and obviously Central Park, are where there were green spaces in New York. And that's going to be very important for him. And this is the area of New York that he's really writing about, below 14th Street, so Manhattan around 1890. So when Riis came to New York, he experienced the kind of poverty that he ends up writing about. So he was homeless, and we know about this because he wrote a memoir called I have to find the Making of an American. And so he had been a carpenter back in Europe. He thought he would be able to be a carpenter in the United States, and he can't. He finds some work, but he never really does very well, and so he actually becomes destitute. He ended up sleeping in doorways. He ended up sleeping in a parked milk wagon, even in a cemetery on a tombstone. So I think it's very important to know about that background of his own experiences of poverty in order to understand why this becomes such a passion for him. Eventually, he finds work as a salesman, and he begins experimenting with journalism, and both in Danish and in English. And his break comes in 1877 when he becomes a police reporter with a press office on Mulberry Street, right near the Mulberry Bend that you read about, which was also near 5 Points. And he ends up working the most crime-ridden and impoverished slums of the city. Writes for the New York Tribune and also for the Associated Press. So what was he writing about, and what did he see? What he was writing about in the 1880s was the horrific overcrowding of New York and the awful tenements. By the 1880s, 334,000 people were crammed into a single square mile of the Lower East Side. Some argue it was the most densely populated place on earth. They were packed into filthy, disease-ridden tenements, and Riis was actually not the only journalist to be writing about them in the 1880s. Others are drawing attention to this, and to give you an example, this is what he's writing about. So here's Mulberry, the Mulberry Bend. One of the places he writes about that you read about, Bandit's Roost. You might be interesting to know that there's a film that uses that still and then tries to recraft it, for authenticity. I forget which movie it was. And of course, that's what Bandit's Roost is today, the Columbus Park Pavilion. But here, the dens of death that he was writing about, or remember he writes about the children rolling off, or people rolling off the roof, and so seen on the roof of the Mott Street Barracks. And I couldn't figure out how to turn this, but this was the old style tenement that he was writing about. So the L's are rooms that actually have windows in them, and then the D's stand for rooms that were dark. And what you can see is that in some of them they've cut windows into them, but what they've cut windows into are just dark spaces. So when he writes, for example, he writes about, the children who were dying from the foul air because there's no air in these buildings, you can get a sense of what he was talking about in that image. He was writing about places like this, the men's lodging room on West 47th Street Station, and the overcrowding and the horrific spaces that people were living in. This one in the sweatshop, that child had lied about his age in order to get a job in the sweatshop. Remember, he writes about the 7-cent lodging house, or making the knee pants. And I find this a particularly striking photo because it's posed, but the man on the right, he's really kind of captured him in mid-sentence. This is one of his particularly famous ones, the children, the street Arabs in their sleeping quarters. More sleeping quarters, Rivington Street and the dump. The lodgers, 5 cents a spot, Bayard Street. This is another one of his particularly well-known ones. The Bohemian cigar makers. He has a whole chapter about the Bohemian cigar makers. And one of his points, I think this photo does a really good job of illustrating one of his points about that from the outside, the houses, they looked fine from the outside. So, it's a brick structure. You have no idea what's really behind that space. But of course, what's behind the space is this, the child who's playing in the dark hallway, left all alone, and that's the child's only playground. And Riis, of course, is talking, one of the points that he talks a lot about is the kinds of social interventions that existed. And so this is an example of that, the prayer time in the nursery, the 5 Points House of Industry, and we'll come back to that. We'll talk more about those. And I want to show you one more image before we end. And this is the image of what he thinks will be the solution to the problem in 1880 when he's writing in 1890 when he's writing the book. And this is the dumbbell tenement. So do you know anything about the dumbbell tenements? Is this something you've studied before? It's not in the book. So one of the reforms that he's talking about, he keeps talking about the Tenement House Act. One of the reforms was that in the late 1870s, there was a competition for people to design a better tenement. And so the dumbbell tenement, and you could see why it's called that, because it looks like you could hold it in the middle and you've got, the barbells on either side of it. The object of the dumbbell tenement was that it had these air shafts over here between the buildings, you can see that there's windows cut into them. And when he's talking about tearing down the rear tenements, like the shanties that you saw before, and building new structures, he's talking about building this. So they end up doing that, especially in the lower part of Manhattan. But the problem is that the houses are so close together that those air shafts between the buildings that are supposed to be letting in light, well, first of all, they go up 6 stories, so they're not letting in light down at the lower level. Secondly, what they become garbage dumps, and so people just throw the garbage out the window, and the smells are awful, and of course, and then fires happen because they throw something out and it sparks, and so then the fires shoot up the air shafts of the dumbbell tenements. So they were by no means the solution that he originally thought they would be. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just shut that because we don't need any more slides. Thanks. There. Okay, thanks. Yeah, we could just pull it out or turn it off. What Riis is doing in the book, kind of like an overall view, is he's talking about the tenements and how they cause he argues that they're the cause of the major problems of poverty in New York, and they cause crime and disease, and that if they could find a solution to them, that would ameliorate the condition. What's caused the problem is this enormous influx of immigrants into New York City. So a city that had I have somewhere the stats, but and he gives you lots of stats. A city that in 35 years had grown from 100,000 people to 500,000 people needs a place to house them, and that's what's causing the great problem. I should tell you that the title of the book, How the Other Half Lives, actually comes from a 16th century novel by François Rabelais called Pantagruel, which I'm sure Lisa's read, but I don't know if anybody else. I saw Mary smile. And it said one half of the world does not know how the other half lives, and that's what he's writing. He's trying to show one half of the world how the other half lives. So let's open it to discussion, and let's start by talking about who his audience is and what do you think his biases are. Let's start there. So who wants to open it? And then I guess, do we need to move the mic around so that it gets taped? Do we have to do that? Oh, it'll be much more interesting if I don't have to do that, don't you think? Yeah. Yeah. So, well, let's start. Who do you think he's writing for? Who do you think he's trying to talk to?
Newspapers of the day. What kind of newspaper was this? What other papers? Do you have any idea what he was competing with?
Right, well, there are other newspapers. I actually don't. Does anybody? I mean, who else, what were the other papers that he's in New York? I mean, surely there were many. I know the Yiddish press better than I actually know the kind of mainstream English language press. But when he's writing, I'm sure there were multiple newspapers, and he's part of a kind of school of journalism of the late 19th century, the muckraking journalism. I mean, I kind of put him with The Jungle. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle is a different kind of expose. But this is an era when all sorts of different individuals and also organized groups of people are trying to attack problems that exist in American society because the government doesn't take. We don't have any of the kind of social welfare networks from the government that eventually evolve, especially later on as a result of their activism and then as a result of the Great Depression. So he's part of a coterie of people doing that. Yeah, just pass the mic around.
Yeah, I would think also maybe he's addressing the reformers, local reformers in both parties, perhaps, because of the ties between Tammany Hall and the corruption in the police and so forth. So I think that may be, and of course that comes through later, of course, with his friendship with Teddy Roosevelt, about 5 years later, and very important development.
Yeah.
In terms of its influence,
Yeah.
They became very close friends.
Yeah, very important development. And you're right. I mean, he's not writing to the subjects of the book. He's not expecting that they're going to read it. He's writing to sort of the white elites, and I think he's actually also writing very much to the white Protestant elites. I think Protestantism. I'm going to grab my notes and then sit down. I think Protestantism is critical. It's a critical component for him. Am I the only one who saw that? Maybe Lisa? He writes at one point about the charitable organizations. Did anybody pick up on that, about what he said about the missions, about the missionaries? Over. He is writing about. I mean, social gospel is certainly is out at this time. I don't think he's talking about social gospel per se, but he keeps talking about these societies that are out there, and Anybody remember the point about the missions? No? He says that there are these organizations in New York City, and there's like an organization, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. But then there are also these organizations that are determined to go, and he actually uses this word, to minister to the Hottentots in Africa. And he's very critical of that because he's saying they would rather save these Christian souls overseas than look downtown to where they are and save the souls who are living in their own city. And it comes out I saw it in a couple of different places in the book. But I think he has a really strong Protestant ethical bias throughout. Anybody else see it besides that example? Yeah, you got the mic back there? Yeah.
Yeah, well, certainly his comments about the Italians and the Jews and the Irish, the immigrants coming in are well, he has sort of a few negative comments about, particularly the Irish and to some extent the Jews. The Germans and the Italians he has a little higher view of, I think. But so that's the other side of the coin that seems to be a sort of an anti-Catholic or somewhat. The Jews he has a sort of ambivalent feeling, I think, about, but he has some favorable comments to say about those. But the Jewish, but in any case, yeah, I think I agree with you. He is a Protestant, I think. That's his background.
Yeah. Let's pass the mic over that way. He's certainly he has ambivalent comments about every single one of the ethnic groups he talks about, or racial groups. I mean, I want to get into that also. I want to talk about race in a minute. But what were you going to say?
I haven't read the book. I was just curious. Does he allude to his own religious conviction as part of his own motivation?
I don't think so. Those of you who've read it, do you think so? Let's pass it back there.
It almost comes off a little bit more of noblesse oblige, that people who have education and money have an obligation to raise the standard of living because these people would not be capable of doing it on their own, not just because they're poor. He sees them as not understanding or appreciating what their potential would be unless the people who own these buildings, who are greedy, turn around and offer them the services and the better life to get them started. But I don't see that as, other than the upper classes being obligated to serve better the lower classes.
Right. Just pass the mic. I think you wanted to comment back.
I'm in a little bit of a blind since I didn't read the book, but did you not say at the beginning that a lot of his perspective was informed by his earlier experience of poverty? So he surely is not identifying with the elite when he takes on this cause, or?
I think he is, because I think he comes from a background, a homeland, a life experience of non-urban, of course, of the intensity of Manhattan. So a situation where people have had some skill, some education, have been self-reliant, have been part of communities that are mutually self-supporting, to him should now translate. I mean, he no longer is part of that mass when he is writing. He is employed, he is bringing in income, he is living a better life, and he has education. So I do think he does not see himself as part of that. He experienced it when he came, but I don't think he views himself as a part of that class.
Right, and that image that those two images I showed you of him, I mean, he does become part of the elites. It's actually why I started by asking you, who do you think he's writing for? Who's his audience?
Could I ask you what you can share with us, if you would, about Jewish organizations in terms of social help at this time? How were they just the ones that dealt with people who came from the same area as they were? Was the shift move later Can you share what you
By
might-
Schiff, did you mean Jacob Schiff?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, now I know what I'm talking about, by the way, because the Jewish stuff I really know. So, I mean, there are 2 chapters in the book where he talks specifically about Jews. So the Jewish migration is part of this enormous migration that's coming in the latter part of the 19th century. And the Jewish migration sparked in 1881. It's been increasing since the 1870s, but there's a moment in 1881 where there's an upsurge because there are these attacks upon Jewish communities in Russia, and because of that, impoverished Jews flee. And the Jews realize they have to take care of their own. This is a long-standing obligation. It dates back to 1655, when the first Jews come to America, and they're told they can stay here as long as their poor will not become a burden on the community. And so the very first thing they do is they found an organization called the Hebrew Emigrant Aid Society. Eventually becomes the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. It's called HIAS. It still exists today. So the Jews are beginning to, they need to take care of their own poor. But you have to remember that when he's writing this, that the Jewish community in New York, they've seen, tens of thousands pour in, which is a striking number, but they have no idea of what's down the road. They have no idea that by the end of the migration period, we're going to be looking at 2 million. So they're just beginning to respond to the crisis. And what I don't know is I don't know how the other ethnic groups are dealing with the crisis of the migration. But I want to get back to his Protestantism, and because I don't know your name in the back. Yeah, Kate. So what Kate was saying about he has, he's recovered. He's gone past the point of poverty, and of course and he tells this. I mean, he's very much an American story of the immigrant who comes and suffers and then rises up. But you said something very important about his sense of the obligations of good Protestants to take care of their poor. And so one of his main points is that he keeps writing about how greedy these people are. The image that I showed you of the 7-cent bunks, and he says that that man makes, I think that was makes like $8,000 a year or something off of what he's off of these spaces that he's selling. And so in his last chapters, he's talking about if only people would decide that they would make a fair profit, which he says is 5%, then we could solve these problems. The landlords, the dignitaries would make enough money, and he gives a couple of examples of altruistic efforts to do this. So he is trying to appeal to, I think, to a Protestant ethic about what is essentially fair and of what is really one's Christian obligation to take care of the poor. I mean, that's how I read it. Do you have thoughts or comments?
I thought he dealt very harshly with the landlords, but it was surprising to me that he doesn't reserve any ire that I can remember for the employers, the people who are outsourcing the work and expecting people. He does talk about how much they made from piece goods and how little they paid people, but he's not nearly as angry with them, even though these people are working 16 hours a day in these filthy conditions and paying them pittance. He's not nearly as angry with them as he is, it seems to me, with some misplaced anger about the housing. The housing conditions are not causing the poverty, it's the wages that are causing the poverty. It seems to me he's a little misplaced in terms of where his anger might be vented.
I saw Kate wants to respond, but how about over here first?
On that score, actually, I had a question. I haven't read the book, so I'm also asking from ignorance. But I mean, the idea that low wages are essentially the cause of poverty and tenements are a consequence or a manifestation of it is much more what I think of as sort of our understanding of poverty, which in turn is somewhat of a Marxian notion. And I wonder whether there's any indication in Riis's book of a notion of class struggle or a notion of class-based politics. Because, I mean, to the extent that there is, it would undercut the notion of a religiously based idea of obligation. And to the extent that there isn't, I mean, I think it would tend to reinforce it.
Right. Did anybody pick up on it?
I was going to say, also in relation to this, that he at one point in the book refers to the need for a living wage,
Right.
which is sort of really very modern type of thinking, I think, or progressive, or whatever you want to call it. But so I think that, you know, he is focused on wages, although he is focused also on the exorbitant rents that these tenements, the tenement owners, you know, force on their, you know, on the tenants.
Right. Let me answer the question, then I want to go. Kate wanted to say something. I am almost positive that there are one or two places where he recognizes the problem in Marxian terms. That he recognizes that he doesn't talk about proletariat. He's not using that kind of language. But I was looking to see if I could find it real fast in my notes. But I remember that he understands the problem as a problem of an economic and social class. But as far as, I mean, you're right, he pays much less attention to the wages than to the conditions of the tenements, because I think that's where he feels that he can make his mark in terms of reform. May well be. Remember, he lectured widely. If you were to look him up on the New York Times historical, you would see, you know, scores of articles talking about he's giving a lecture here at the YMCA. I mean, and he was doing that, by the way, before publishing the book. He was going out and trying to get attention for this. So, it may well be that he talked about that more in other places, but it seems to me that he's very much focused on tenement reform. Kate, you were going to say something.
Really, it's just piggybacking that. I think his focus was the greed of landlords, because, of course, the wages only seem more low if you can buy less with it. If they were making these, admittedly, depressed wages, considering the employers were making a great deal of money off of their efforts, but they were paid very low. But it wouldn't have been as excruciating if, on the other side, the people who were taking advantage of them did not strip them of the little bit they had so aggressively. If they could have found better living conditions, they would not have seemed as poor despite low wages. So, and I think you were right, his argument frequently was talking about class differences, but not so much in the Marxist term, because he really wasn't celebrating the masses. He was saying they needed to be pitied and helped, that they weren't noble, they were just human beings who deserved a better break at the hands of their fellow man, not so much that it was, you know, cheering on the proletariat.
Over here, Whit.
So I want to build on that. So does it mean that he's a little condescending though? I mean, if he doesn't believe in the power of the mass, he's not speaking for them, but he's speaking to the elite and asking the elite to do something for the poor mass. Mm-hmm. I'm just asking. I'm not sure. I don't know. And the other question, now that I'm at it, I'm asking that, you know, you said that he gave a lot of talks, you know, during the time that he published the book. But at the beginning of the discussion, you said that he was pretty much a forgotten man until 1947. So I wonder about his legacy. When all the scandals that he revealed at the time, did it really affect the reforms that happened in the first decade of the 20th century, or did it have to wait until he was celebrated again in the 40s?
No, I mean, he has, you know, he publishes the book 1890, and by the way, did I say this? It was first issued without the photos. and then a second, and then it didn't have any impact. So he has tremendous impact. And you were talking about, I don't know your name, about Bob, is it Bob? Yeah, so Bob was talking about, I mean, he becomes friends with Theodore Roosevelt. And so he wins tremendous acclaim, and he is, there's a lot of attention paid to the problems of the poor in the lower part of Manhattan, as, of course, immigration continues to swell and swell down through, the war, 1914, and then into the 20s. But Riis, as a reformer, and the work is pretty much lost to public memory after his death in 1914, and I would say, and then we'll take your comment, and I would say in part because a lot has happened, and because he's supplanted by, immigration, the gates to immigration close, these neighborhoods begin to get cleaned up a little bit. People move out. New lines of mass transit open up in New York City, and certainly the Jews, I know. They move to Brooklyn and the Bronx, so the neighborhoods become less dense. So as a social reformer, his legacy is kind of lost, and it's really this rediscovery of his photographs. And I don't know what you thought of the book. I'd really like to hear your opinions about the book as, like a book to sit down and read. So does that kind of like answer some of your questions? So let's
Just actually a quick question based on some of your remarks. There is Jacob Riis State Park, the beach. When was that named?
It's late because I saw it when I was kind of
So is it
running.
after 47, I guess, when he was rediscovered?
Yeah, I think it's later than that. I remember seeing something about it, but I don't know.
That's sort of a benchmark for him
Right.
being noticed.
Right, for him being discovered. What did you think? Yeah. Oh, wait. Yeah.
So, do you think that he's condescending?
Oh, yeah. Do I think he's condescending? Well, I'm not going to answer that because I'm going to let you guys answer that, and we can talk about that because I think that's a really important point to talk about. So let's talk first about what you thought about the book, and then let's come back and talk about Whit's question about condescending. Because I didn't get general reactions to the book. I don't know if you had a chance to read it or had anything to. Not in a long time. Yeah, I know. Others who might have,
I think I would view it differently because we're reading it now with the sensibilities and sensitivities we share these days. The book is written as a rant. It's an aggressive rant. It's not something we would consider tidied up to be, a well-structured plea for his case. It is a very heartfelt, I think, throwing this out there, accusatory, angry book. And I think somebody coming at these issues today would write it differently because of trying to woo the people.
Right. Yeah, I was actually thinking, I haven't read it. Has anybody read Catherine Boo's book on India, the poverty in India? It was on the bestseller list this past year. And I actually, and it's supposed to be beautifully written and very moving. And I actually was thinking that it would be interesting to have a juxtaposition of the two books, but
I think this is more, I'm angry, here's a
Right.
problem,
Yeah.
you've got to stop behaving this way, and it's our duty to do something,
Yeah.
period.
Here's a massive statistics about it also. As a book to read, I know you haven't read it in a long time, but as a book to read, it's not like an engaging read. Yeah. Whit? Yeah.
When I read it, I had a different take because from where I come from, Vietnam.
So from where I come from, I see this kind of tenements. It's not something that is, we look back to see. So when I read his, I only read excerpts. I have great sympathy for those people, and I like what he has to say. And it's very real to me and recent.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
The amount of detail in the book is extraordinary. The personalization, which as a newspaper man, he obviously has learned to use as he learned to use the photographs, makes it come alive. This is not a sociologist's dry research book. This is a passionate, you talk about it as a rant. I'd say it was an impassioned plea of a man who deeply cares and who appeals to every emotion and every sympathy you might have in a very succinct way. He writes as a man whose English is not the first language. He's mastered the language. He has mastered the art of the paragraph, of the developed essay, and I think it's an extraordinary piece of work for the time. There is nothing much like this anywhere.
Right. Oh, I absolutely agree. So let's go back to Whit's question about was he condescending to the people? Because I actually was one of the things I really wanted to talk about is maybe talk about the different groups that he writes about, and what you think. So Bob, it looks like you've got the mic.
I was just going to say, in connection with what Pat was saying, that I mean he is a journalist, and so he's one of the first of the muckrakers and playing on people's emotions, and it was a very popular. I mean, the yellow press and all of that, and so he's appealing to the audience of his time, and I think it does. I mean, the book is popular, I think. But combined with that, the statistics, because I'm an economist, so that I'm a historian too, but the statistics bolster what he's trying to say on an emotional level. There is a rational level, and he takes a great deal of time to try and get at statistics and uses census figures and so forth. So there is an extra dimension to his book in that sense.
Right, which I think he thought he needed.
Yes.
He couldn't just tell these stories, and he has some, deeply moving and terrifying stories, especially some of the things that happened to the children. But what do you think about? I mean, all right. So I don't care which ethnic group we start with first. You want to pick one to talk about? Because I think that he's writing from a perspective not only of the Protestant, world and Protestant ethic, but he's convinced that there's Anglo-Saxon superiority. And so every group he talks about, the Jews or the Italians or the African Americans or the Chinese, he has some very strong opinions about their racial, he uses the word race, their racial characters. And so I thought it would be interesting to kind of see if we could unpack some of what he was saying about those groups. Does anybody want to take a stab? Whit?
No, it just comes back. Is it true? Yeah, I think I remember the chapter about the Chinese, and he said that they were prone to living in dirty conditions, and they are disease-ridden, they are disease carriers as well, and that's their characteristic, and it's built in their personality or their being, physiology or something like that. Is that true? I remember it now.
Yeah,
I think I read it.
he says some. I mean, I don't remember if I don't have that in my notes, and I'm seeing you saying he didn't say that. He says that about some of the other groups, but he starts with Joss has cheekily planted his pagan worship of idols, and chief among them are his own gains and lusts, and he makes money on everything he does. And he goes on, he says the Chinese can never become Christians. They have senseless idolatry, mere grub worship. He talks about Chinatown and the burning of opium, the clink of coins, prostitution, but it's one of the few places actually where he pays attention to women. It's very, I mean, somebody who reads for gender a lot. There's not a whole lot on that here, but there's prostitution, but none of the girls are underage. There's gambling. And at the end of the chapter on Chinatown, he says the Chinese are in no sense a desirable element. They're always hitting the pipe, but having let them in, we have to make the best of it. And so what we should do to solve the problem is they should bring their wives. So I was curious what you think about that discourse. Is it Pat? Are you Pat?
Pat.
Yeah.
But it isn't at all clear that he has had a conversation with people who probably don't necessarily want to engage. He says of them, they want to be left alone. It isn't clear that he's ever had a conversation with any of them. And on the issue of dirtiness, as a matter of fact, he says they are the cleanest
Yeah.
people, and that's why they have opened laundries.
Right. Yeah, that's why they
Just
vote. I
a
forgot.
stereotype here.
Yeah.
But he doesn't know these people. You have the sense he's looking at them from the outside in, and knowing their proclivity and fear, probably, of talking to anyone. It isn't clear that he's ever talked to any of them, and that's true, I think, of the people that he criticizes. Inevitably, he talks about the fact that various groups don't speak English.
Mm-hmm.
And now, how are they going to learn English when they're working 16 hours a day? It isn't clear how he expects that to happen. The issue of making money and greed that he brings up, both for the Jews, for the other groups as well, does speak to this issue that you raised before about class issues. One would wonder how anyone would not be greedy living in such tremendous poverty, but somehow the group that escapes his criticism in that way are the blacks,
Right.
of whom he says perhaps the most flattering things of any of the groups. And that, I thought, was very interesting in terms of the discriminatory views of his time. He doesn't fall into that pit.
Right.
He, in fact, is rather complimentary
Right.
of that group.
Yeah. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's always a little difficult to try and figure out what the sort of standard ideas of the time were. I mean, it's easy for us to look back and be appalled, but if I remember right, 1890 is just after the Chinese exclusion laws are passed.
Mhm.
And so the idea that anybody would argue that there should be any kind of significant immigration from China, even if it's only bringing in wives, is actually extraordinarily progressive for that period. And although I certainly don't have statistics about this, my sense is that, in fact, the Chinese American community in 1890 was probably overwhelmingly male. In earlier decades, it was certainly, on astronomical proportions, something like 100 to 1 male to female, because it was more or less indentured laborers who were shipped over to the United States. And so, to some degree, unpalatable as these kind of stereotypes might sound to our ears, they were probably, to some degree, both progressive and accurate in terms of the assessment of what some of the problems of the Chinese community were in New York in 1890. It's a complicated thing to try and figure out exactly where to pigeonhole somebody like this, but I think it is important to keep some of those things in mind.
I absolutely agree with you. And one of I read an article about him called Walking the Ethnic Tightrope by Bill Hugg. And one of the things that he talks about is that, and that's why I started with audience, is that Riis is very careful. So he's just giving all of these kinds of stereotypes about these different groups. He's writing about them, but he also periodically undermines what he's saying, and he's doing it deliberately because he's doing it for the audience that he thinks this is what the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants that he hopes are going to make these changes will hear, and so they need their prejudices reinforced. But he kind of undercuts those prejudices, and the example where he talks about the Jews is kind of perfect, because he on the one hand he praises them for their industriousness and for their efforts to lift themselves up, and to he talks about them eventually becoming owners of the tenements. On the other hand, he repeats every single anti-Semitic stereotype that one would have expected for the late 19th century, and so there's a lot of craft that went into the writing, went into his choices of what he wrote about. And you're right, the chapter about the African Americans, one of the things that really struck me about that was that he's aware of the Great Migration. at a time from the South. I mean, he writes about them, you know, so many of them have come up from the South, and we know about the Great Migration, but we tend to think of it more later in the 20th century, and he's got this whole sense of that. He's living in the middle of that Great Migration. I don't know if any of you read Isabel Wilkerson's Warmth of Other Suns. Yeah. So, and her characters are all, of course, later, they're 20th century characters, in part because she wants to be able to tell these complete stories. But he's saying no, it's already well underway, and he also says that it's the landlords who make the color line. They're the ones who decide where they're going to live. And so I thought that was really interesting. Mary, and then or over here, and then we'll go to Mary.
Oh, I was just curious. Do we know who the landlords were who he was talking about? Are they members of the sort of elite moneyed class? Are they immigrants who have moved up one notch on the ladder? Does he talk about who the landlords are?
He talks about a lot of them were Irish who had come in earlier and had made money, but he talks about others as well. So, and he gives a couple of illustrations, but one I'm thinking of towards the end of the book, where it's a woman who essentially runs a model tenement, and therefore the tenants do so much better because she's created this kind of model tenement. I mean, that was actually one of the other points I want to emphasize this, and it's part of the reason why he talks about tenements as opposed to wages. He's really an environmental determinist. The environment is what shapes how you're going to be. So if you live in a pleasant environment, and this is his idea, if these landlords will make improvements to their tenements, then the people are capable of rising to the occasion. Mary, you wanted to say something, and then we'll go back to Bob.
Pamela, I apologize for being one of the non-readers in the room.
I'm used to that. You know, I teach.
I didn't do the homework.
But you came to class.
Yes. I'll make it obvious with this question. If he discussed the family or lack thereof among the Asian Americans in these tenements, does he do the same with the African Americans? I'm just curious about whether he made any observations that would anticipate the Moynihan report or the opposite side of the Moynihan report.
Yeah. I think Pat wanted to answer that. No, go on.
My sense is he does not get into anything like that.
Yeah.
He talks about the fact that they are easygoing, people filled with humor, that they take life as it comes, that they work hard, he's critical, if I'm remembering, about how they spend their money, that they spend too much money on clothing and appearance and things. How he wanted them to spend the money isn't clear, but he does not approve of that.
Too much on gambling, too much on drinking. I mean, he says something about that. But no, he actually is not right. Family structure for him is not a critical factor in the problems that exist. It really is the wider environment. And he does, he kind of catches us by reminding us that it's only 25 years since they've been emancipated. And so he actually, I agree with Pat, he's very laudatory. He says, after all the abuse that African Americans have suffered, after all the victimization, he's almost saying, look how far they've come. But what's preventing them from going further is that they live in these horrible conditions, and they, of course, are actually among the greatest victims of the tenements. They pay the most amount of money for the worst housing, for the worst environments. Mary, and then Lisa.
Thank you. Again, I'm speaking out of ignorance. If he talks about what happy personalities they have and how easygoing and good-humored and so on they are, that almost sounds like perpetuating the stereotype of the happy darkies in the quarter to some extent.
Yeah, well, but that's what he does with every single one of the groups. So the Italians are colorful, and Lisa.
I have another question from someone who didn't do the reading. So how does he deal with poor people's own attempts to solve their problems? Does he put their political perspectives into this book? And does he worry at all about how that would, no?
No, because he's totally writing from that position of Anglo-Saxon privilege. So he doesn't, it's not, I mean, I know in part probably where it's coming from, because we see, like, the East European Jewish community, we see them trying to solve their own problems. And so, for example, they create all sorts of organizations that the immigrants themselves create to provide social safety nets, like the Landsmannschaften, for example, which date to the 1880s and the 1890s. And they provide nets to take care of their own. But he has no awareness of the potential for any kind of self-help on the part of these immigrant groups.
And socialism, does that figure at all in this?
No, not at all. I mean, other than these kind of oblique references, there's like, I'm sure there's one, unless it's something else that I was reading, where there's this one reference to that, you know, the potential for rebellion. But beyond that, no, he's not part of that discourse at all.
What about politics in general?
Where he pays attention to politics is in corruption. So, for example, the jails are emptied. I mean, a lot. We haven't actually talked about this yet, but what, you know, he writes a great deal about crime. And we just, that's not a subject that we've touched on yet. So he goes to the police stations. He writes about there's a raid one night, and he doesn't know if the raid is going to be on the gambling joints or on the saloons or on the opium dens. But he's a police reporter. He's following them around. And so where he writes about politics is corruption in the police, beating up on the people that they've arrested, but more importantly on how at election time they empty the jails, and then all of these people go out and vote for the candidates that emptied the jails and bought them a beer. Yeah, Bob.
Just to add to that, I mean, he was a crime reporter,
Yeah.
and then his influence when he got to know Teddy Roosevelt, when he was one of the commissioners of the police in New York, and Roosevelt and Riis would go around together to try and uncover officers who were not doing their duty or corrupt and so forth. So that was an important part. But I wanted to say one more word on the environmental determinism, because several parts of the book, he says in the heat of the summer, they didn't have enough water, and the babies and even adults, but babies particularly, would be dying off. Mm-hmm. And he was very concerned about that because a year or two after the book, he wrote a book on the water supply of New York.
I didn't know that.
And this is frankly from Wikipedia. But anyway, that book led to the establishment of the New Croton Reservoir to have a reliable water supply in New York in the 1890s. So that was an important part of his environmental concerns.
Yeah, I mean, his description of the summers in those tenements is just heartrending. I mean, you can imagine in those tenements where there's, you know, you're in these rooms that have absolutely no ventilation. I mean, you know what it's like in the summer in Washington and New York. And I mean, no wonder they're living on the roofs, and then they're rolling off at night if they roll in the wrong direction. So I didn't know that, but he does write about, and there's not a drop of water anywhere to drink. It's not just for bathing, but not even to drink. What? Right. He actually, I mean, it was one of the things, because Whit knows that I'm interested in women's history. It's one of the things that I actually was surprised about how little there was about gender in the book. So there's one section where he talks about, let me find it. in my notes. There's one chapter on the working girls of New York, and he's talking about he talks about the song of the shirt. So he's talking about the shirt, the women who are working on the shirtwaist, and what he writes there is that that men's wages, there's a limit to how low they can fall, but there's no limit to how low women's wages can fall. So he actually is, in a sense, recognizing what's going to become a major problem in the garment industry, and of course, it's almost 2 full decades after he publishes this, when the shirtwaist makers launched their strike. But he says that there are 150,000 working women in the city, and that and he talks, and I mean, many of his chapters he talks about the horrific working conditions, and so this is one where he talks about both the women who are sewing, and then also the women who are clerks in stores, who stand for 16 hours a day and pay for their own aprons and are not allowed to sit down and faint from the toil. And so that chapter is also a little bit where you get a kind of the Marx influence, because he's talking about the uptown people going shopping with it, and going up to these stores. So if you're listening for the class conflict, you can hear it there. But I'm not sure that he's writing from that perspective. Yeah, over here.
Much of his tradition comes from looking at what was going on earlier in the 19th century in England, because a lot of the reform, it's been a real long time since I've read his book, but it strikes me it's very similar to a lot of the stuff that was going on in England. If you look at something like the Mayhew works of the London Labour and the London Poor, which is very similar to this book, and the issues of dealing with the sewing and all of that is a big concern. And also the paternalistic voice of this, which of course for their reformers is exactly the same. So how much was he aware of that tradition, because it's somewhat earlier?
I'm trying to remember if I read it in the introduction or I read it somewhere else. He's aware of, he writes at one point about London, and he has it in his statistics in the back, I think also. He's aware of the overcrowding in London, but that New York is so much worse. How much he knows about what's going on in terms of reform and what kinds of transnational, international connections he has, I don't know anything specifically about that. But what I do know is that these kinds of reformist movements were transnational, and so it would not surprise me if he was aware of what was being written elsewhere. I mean, we even know. You can go before the Civil War in the United States, and we know about the way in which newspapers, I'm thinking in particular of ethnic newspapers in the United States and the Jewish community, and they travel to Jewish communities around the world. So this is Adam and Mendelssohn's work. And so they, so by the 1840s, I mean, we can find things that are being talked about in Philadelphia and Charleston, and we find them being talked about among Jews living in Australia. So I wouldn't surprise me that he would know about this, but I don't know much about that. It's just something I don't know. Does anybody have any background on that? Mary?
I think there's an echo of Disraeli's Sybil, or Two Nations. You thought the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me at all. You also have to remember, I mean, I know specifically about what they called white slavery back then. And so there are these international conferences on white slavery. And so are there international conferences on how to on tenement reform or how to solve the problems of the poor? Wouldn't surprise me. I just don't know about it. Yeah. What?
This gender thing. So I read some part about the tenement, how the apartments were windowless, and all the garbage problem. So it's not personal. It's not about people. So when he does talk about people, he just talk about people, like genderless, like no, it's not a man, not a woman. So how does he write about that?
It's the Jews, it's the Chinese, it's the Italians, and they're all and until I mean, he's talking about the Chinese, and until you get to where he says, well, they should bring their wives over, you have no idea that he's not talking about Chinese men and women. He's really of an era which lasts for a very long time when male is the normative. And so, and when he talks about Jews and he talks about Jewtown, he's talking about men. He also, to be honest, he has some photographs of the women's prison, but most, well, I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking, and those of you who read the editions that have the photos, most of the photos of men, what do you think? Lot of kids. Well, he's very interested in children because children are the future, and if you don't solve the problem for them, that it's never going to be solved. So, yeah, I'm just maybe it's just that some of his most famous images, especially like the one of the street Arabs, look like they're little boys. So, he's not living. He's not aware of gender and I don't know that he was in anything else. I mean, in his personal life, it's a really kind of lovely story because he falls in love with this, that he was in love with a woman and her father wouldn't let him marry. And this is back in Denmark, and she marries somebody else and he dies, and then they end up getting married. It's really quite lovely. So, and she comes to the U.S. Bob.
My sense of Riis is that he's a forerunner of the progressives. The progressive movement really comes full bloom in around 1900, but he's one of the ones who anticipates, I think, to some extent, the progressive movement. I just wanted to get your sense of where you think he is in terms of American history and the progressive movement.
I don't know if I've never been. Are you clear on when the progressive movement starts? You think it's 1900? Yeah.
Yeah, according to Hofstadter, the progressive movement from 1900 to 1915 is the height of the progressive movement.
I have some problems with that because there are a lot of initiatives that I would characterize as part of the progressive movement that maybe because you don't have quite that coalition of activists operating at the national level until 1900, but I think of efforts to clean up the playgrounds. I think of a lot of the things that the Chicago Women's Club was trying to do in 1893. I think of those initiatives as part of the progressive movement. So I put him in the progressive movement. Certainly what you can say is his writing leads to the progressive movement, if you prefer. After all, he's still active in speaking post-1900. But I'm not so comfortable with just Hofstadter was a long time ago. You can tell I'm not an American historian. But I'm not so comfortable with just saying like 1900 and that's where we're going to start that periodization. Yeah. Do you have something? Yeah.
I'm actually wondering why this book was picked over other books that might have been written in the time, if this was a selected book. I mean, and what I'm thinking of particularly is 20 Years at Hull House and Jane Addams. And, why a book that talked about what was being done in what kinds of responses were in play,
right.
Wouldn't be more transformative, wouldn't be more influential, although her writing is in a style that's very hard for people to read. But, yeah.
Do you want to say something about the list? Because there's a big list.
Yeah, for the library.
Right.
It's not us.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not asking a question. I'm more thinking
Yeah.
out loud about why the powers that be.
So, Catherine, thank you. and the list remains controversial for these very reasons. There's a lot that was in that remains controversial, and there are many books that didn't make the list that many think should have. And the folks who put the list together down the street at the Library of Congress tried to select books that they thought did shape the conversation, for better or worse. So some of the books that you mentioned, we may not recognize. And what they tried to identify in these 80 books that made the list from the 19th and 20th century were books that we would recognize, that did shape the national conversation during those times, for better or worse. They're not the best books, but they were influential. And they moved the national conversation, maybe in ways we don't like. And some of them have been discredited. They may have been terrible books, but they moved the national conversation, and that was the criterion.
Lisa, and then.
But I think that's a really, great thing to think about because, where does this book fit in 1890? It's not a book about progressive reform. It's more like my 8-year-old son just did a report on Nellie Bly. Nellie Bly's 10 Days in a Madhouse was 1887. It's the same thing, a journalist exposing terrible conditions that you don't normally see. That's not the same thing as making reform happen. So it's a different moment, right? It's about the scandal of, the disgusting ways people are treated, or the man's inhumanity to man, or something like that.
You wanted to say something?
Curious, what do we know about how this book was received when it first came out?
The Times gave it a great review. I mean, what we know is that it kind of sank until they did the photos. Till they republished with
So
the photos,
it
and then it got a tremendous amount of attention.
But when you say when they did the photos, that's in the 40s?
They published one edition, and then they published another edition with the photographs.
That was in the 1940s?
No, 1890.
So the photos were almost contemporary with the publication of the book.
Yeah.
Who did so with the photographs. He had slides,
Right.
basically, before this was ever done anywhere else that I have ever read about,
Right.
and talked to the picture.
In fact, that's the genesis of my question, is did people understand him as talking about poverty, or talking about immigration, or talking about
Housing.
cities and housing? How was he received when he first started to get noticed?
Did you want to say
I
something?
can't speak to that. I'm just looking at the introduction to the Penguin edition here in terms of its description of what happened after the book and the legal and
All the laws.
corruption numerous committees that were formed as a result of his activities and probably that of others. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, police, Tammany Hall,
Right.
prostitution, gambling. There were, this book cites 5 different committees that were set up to deal with the problems that he had highlighted. I mean, that's rather
Yeah.
remarkable. One man, I mean, obviously, he didn't take credit.
Because mostly what we've been talking about is immigrants and the conditions immigrants lived in. And yet, when the book was published and started to get noticed, the kinds of reform it prompted were more along the lines of political corruption and crime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not this right because when we're talking about 1890 and the huge the push towards immigration restriction comes much later.
Yes.
After many, many more millions of immigrants have come into America, and American nativism has risen, and at this point, there's still the sense that America wants the immigrants because they need the workers, and so there's no discussion. There's a gradual there's legislation that's passed that gradually restricts who can come in. So there's a law. I remember once reading about a law that said no idiots or imbeciles can come into America. It's like 1905. So they keep restricting who can come into America, but they're not about to close the gates. And he's not writing about immigration restriction. That's not the problem. The problem is the housing for him. Yeah, and that's why I said it's environmental determinism. America needs these people, but America has to treat them right and in order to have a just society. Yeah. Any other comments? Yeah. Pat.
To what degree was he lauded in his own day? The fact that he fell out of favor or forgot, but it would appear that he was extraordinarily
Yeah.
well known. He
Yeah.
spoke all over the place. He wrote his stories. People knew his name.
Mhm.
Do you have any sense about how was he given awards? Was he lauded? Was he thought of well? Was he in danger of his life?
Yeah.
Do you have any idea?
I don't know. Bob, do you know?
Certainly his association with Teddy Roosevelt.
Right.
And Teddy Roosevelt said at one point he thought Riis was the best man in America, which is a rather strong statement.
Yeah.
But they were very, very close. And so the police reforms and the housing reforms in the mid-1890s, because not only was Roosevelt commissioner of police, he also became governor of New York, which
Right.
was on a statewide level. So I think Riis had a lot of influence through Teddy Roosevelt and opened Roosevelt's eyes to what was going on, taking him around the slums of New York and broadened Roosevelt's
Right.
outlook. And
Yeah, I mean, certainly his obituary in the New York Times shows that, you know, he was honored, greatly honored. I don't know if he got awards, but he was greatly honored for the work, the pioneering work that he did, and he went on to write other books and, you know, and to sell widely. So it's more that he kind of drifted into obscurity after 1914 because America began to have other issues on its agenda. And so it's not that and then when the photographs get, you know, shown in such important ways, and his reputation as a photojournalist, as a pioneer of photojournalism in the United States soars, then he's recovered in a sense. And so today, you know, he's taught, like we were talking before about an undergraduate class that Witt had TA'd for, and sections of research are taught in that. And so, it's not, I mean, he never totally disappeared, but he just wasn't as kind of prominent and seen as, you know, an important part of teaching this aspect of American history. Did you want to say something? No, I thought I saw. So, Don?
Join me in thanking Professor Nadell. And on behalf of the library and the School of Professional and Extended Studies, I want to thank you for coming tonight and let you know that in just a few weeks we're going to be back here in this very spot. I love what they call this place, the Mud Box, here at the library. And our topic on June 4 is going to be the narrative life of Frederick Douglass. And that was by Frederick Douglass, autobiography. And leading that discussion, assistant professor in the Department of Government, Tom Merrill, in the School of Public Affairs. And he's going to talk about that wonderful autobiography, wonderful discussion for all of you. If you'll come back, and if you want to have a reminder, we have a little sign-up sheet on the counter back there at one of those tables. We'll email you. You'll get a personalized invitation to remind you. Come on back, and we'll also have more cookies, more free coffee and tea. And please help yourselves on the way out, because we don't want to do nasty things with those things. We'd like to have you take those with you tonight, all right? Thanks for coming out tonight. Really appreciate the great discussion. Thank you. Thanks, Pam.